Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be reading The Oxcart Man, but I'm also going to try and do this simultaneously on Facebook. So we'll see how that goes. Let's see if that works. Video. Hopefully this will be great and I'll be able to. All right. So, whoops. Okay, so each is using a different camera. Ha! That's going to make this really exciting.
Can you switch?
I don't know if I can switch.
No.
Oh, webcam integrated. Okay, good. Now they're on the same camera. It's going to be very funny to watch this back. This is very actively live content. But I'm going to stick to... So I'm going to be reading The Oxcart Man as part of my everyday... Hi, Tatsu.
You're not live yet.
I'm not live yet. No, I'm not live on Facebook, so we're going to keep going. All right, Facebook. Now I'm doing this simultaneously, I think, on Facebook and YouTube. So every day for the last weekish, it's been a week, almost a week, I've been reading a storybook aloud, and then I read a chapter of a chapter book. So today I'm reading The Oxcart Man, and I've been doing it on YouTube, but I'm going to try and do it here too. So maybe somebody would watch me. So we'll just start. This is a wonderful picture book, by the way. Very famous picture book. So this is The Oxcart Man by Donald Hall and pictures by Barbara Cooney. Oops, maybe I should put this one. It's easier for me. Okie doke. In October, he packed his cart, his ox. Let's start that again. In October, he backed his ox into his cart, and he and his family filled it up with everything they made or grew all year long that was left over. He packed a bag of wool he sheared from the sheep in April. He packed a shawl his wife wove on a loom, from yarn spun at the spinning wheel, from the sheep sheared in April. He packed 5 pairs of mittens his daughter knit, from the yarn spun at the spinning wheel, from the sheep sheared in April. It's always nice to have story time, even if you're a grown-up, I've decided. I'm really enjoying reading these. He packed candles the family made. He packed linen from flax they grew. He packed shingles he split himself. He packed birch brooms his son carved with a borrowed kitchen knife. He packed potatoes they dug from their garden, but first he counted out potatoes enough to eat all winter and paid potatoes for seed next spring. He packed a barrel of apples, honey and honeycombs, turnips and cabbages, a wooden box of maple sugar from the maples they tapped in March, when they boiled and boiled and boiled the sap away. He packed a bag of goose feathers that his children collected from the barnyard geese. It's almost syruping time. Hopefully that will happen this year just as well as it always does. It's one of my favorite times of year. When his cart was full, he waved goodbye to his wife and his daughter and his son, and he walked at his ox's head for 10 days, over hills, through valleys, and by streams, past farms and villages. until he came to Portsmouth and Portsmouth Market. You see the tall ships? In a couple of days, I'm going to be reading Island Boy, which is the same illustrator. It's also about similar topics, so from an island perspective. He sold the bag of wool. He sold the shawl his wife made. He sold 5 pairs of mittens. He sold candles and shingles. He sold birch brooms. He sold potatoes. He sold apples. He sold honey and honeycombs, turnips and cabbages. He sold maple sugar. He sold a bag of goose feathers. Then he sold the wooden box he carried the maple sugar in. Then he sold the barrel he carried the apples in. Then he sold the bag he carried the potatoes in. Then he sold his ox cart. Then he kissed his ox and then he sold his ox and kissed him goodbye on the nose. Then he sold his ox yoke and harness. With his pockets full of coins, he walked through Portsmouth Market. He bought an iron kettle to hang over the fire at home. And for his daughter, he bought an embroidery needle that came from a boat in the harbor that had sailed all the way from England. And for his son, he bought a barlow knife for carving birch brooms with. And for the whole family, he bought 2 pounds of wintergreen peppermint candies. Oops. This book hasn't been read in a long time, so the pages are sticking together a bit. Then he walked home with the needle and the knife and the wintergreen peppermint candies tucked into the kettle, and a stick over his shoulder stuck through the kettle's handle, and the coins still in his pockets. Past farms and villages, over hills, through valleys, by streams, until he came to his farm, and his son and his daughter and his wife were waiting for him. It's a beautiful sunset. And his daughter took her needle and began stitching, and his son took his barlow knife and started whittling, and they cooked dinner in their new kettle. And afterwards, everyone ate a wintergreen peppermint candy. And that night, the ox cart man sat in front of his fire, stitching new harnesses for the young ox in the barn. Oops. And he carved a new yoke, and he sawed planks for a new cart, and split shingles all winter. And his wife made flax into linen all winter, and his daughter embroidered linen all winter, and his son carved Indian brooms from birch all winter, and everybody made candles. And in April, they sheared the sheep, spun yarn, and wove and knitted. And in May, they planted potatoes and turnips and cabbages, while apple blossoms bloomed and fell, while bees woke up, starting to make new honey. It's a nice salt box house. So it's pointed in the wrong direction. The slope is supposed to go up against the hill. And geese squawked in the barnyard, dropping feathers as soft as clouds. The end. So normally I change videos over when I switch to the chapter book, but because I'm reading Understood Betsy, which is based also on a New England farm, I think I'll just continue here and do them all as one lump sum. So if you're just joining, and you can go back and see all the other books that I've read aloud and recorded. They're on a YouTube channel that I've created called Kitchen Table Stories, and you'll recognize that it has this image as the logo. So I'm reading Understood Betsy, which is a lovely story that is one of my favorites growing up, about a little girl who is sort of forced to go to Vermont against her will, and what happens when she arrives. So she has just arrived, and now she's settling into life at Putney Farm, a place that she was always told by her other aunts was a horrible place where children had to do crazy things like chores. So she's waking up in the new place. A short morning. Aunt Abigail was gone. Eleanor, the cat, was gone. The room was quite empty, except for the bright sunshine pouring through in the small paned windows. Elizabeth Ann stretched and yawned and looked about her. What funny wallpaper it was, so old-fashioned looking. The picture was of a blue river and a brown mill with green willow trees over it, and a man with his sacks on his horse's back stood in front of the mill. This picture was repeated a great many times all over the paper, and in the corner where it hadn't come out even, they had to cut it right in the middle of the horse. It was very curious looking. She stared at it a long time, waiting for somebody to tell her when to get up. At home, Aunt Frances always told her and helped her get dressed. But here, nobody came. She discovered that the heat came from a hole in the floor near the bed, which opened down into the room below. From it came the warm breath of baking bread and a muffled thump every once in a while. The sun rose higher and higher, and Elizabeth Ann grew hungrier and hungrier. Finally, it occurred to her that it was not absolutely necessary to have somebody tell her to get up. She reached for her clothes and began to dress. When she had finished, she went out into the hall with a return of her aggrieved, abandoned feeling. You must remember that her stomach was very empty. And she began to try to find her way downstairs. She soon found the steps, went down them one at a time, pushed open the door at the foot. Cousin Anne, the brown-haired one, was ironing near the stove. She nodded and smiled as the child came into the room and said, "Well, you must feel rested." "Oh, I haven't been asleep," she said, exclaimed Elizabeth Ann. "I was waiting for someone to tell me to get up." "Oh," said Cousin Anne, opening her black eyes a little. "Were you?" She said no more than this, but Elizabeth Ann hastily decided that she would not add that, as she had been about to, that she was also waiting for someone to help her dress and do her hair. As a matter of fact, she had enjoyed doing her hair the first time she'd ever tried it. Elizabeth Ann, for those of you just joining, is 9. It had never occurred to Aunt Frances that her little baby girl was grown up enough to be her own hairdresser, nor had it occurred to Elizabeth Ann that this might be possible. But as she struggled with the snarls, she had had a sudden wild idea of doing it a different way from the pretty fashion Aunt Frances always followed. Elizabeth Ann had always secretly envied a girl in her class whose hair was all tied back from her face with one big knot in her ribbon at the back of her neck. It looked so grown up. And this morning she had done hers that way, turning her neck till it ached so that she could see the coveted tight effect at the back. And still, aren't little girls queer? Although she'd enjoyed doing her own hair, she was very much inclined to feel hurt because Cousin Anne had not come to do it for her. Cousin Anne set her iron down with the soft thump which Elizabeth Ann had heard upstairs. She began folding a napkin and said, "Now reach yourself a bowl off the shelf yonder. The oatmeal's in the kettle on the stove and the milk is in the blue pitcher. If you want a piece of bread and butter, here's a new loaf just out of the oven, and the butter's in that brown crock." Elizabeth Ann followed these instructions and sat down before this quickly assembled breakfast in a much surprised silence. At home, it took the girl more than half an hour to get breakfast and set the table, and then she had to wait on them besides. She began to pour the milk out of the pitcher and stopped suddenly. "Oh, I'm afraid I've taken more than my share," she said apologetically. Cousin Anne looked up from her rapidly moving iron and said in an astonished voice, "Your share? What do you mean?" "My share of the court," explained Elizabeth Ann. At home, they bought a quart of milk and a cup of cream every day, and they were all very conscientious of not taking more than their due share. "Good land, children, take all the milk you want," said Cousin Anne, as though she had found something shocking in what the little girl had just said. Elizabeth Ann thought herself that she spoke as though milk ran out of a faucet, like water. She was very fond of milk, and she made a very good breakfast, as she sat looking about the low-ceilinged room. It was unlike any room she had ever seen. Now, I should pause and say what you're about to hear is my grandmother's favorite description and the reason that I always have geraniums. It was, of course, the kitchen, and yet it didn't seem possible that the same word could be applied to that room and the small dark cubby hole that had been Grace's asthmatical kingdom. This room was very long and narrow, and all along one side were windows with white ruffled curtains drawn back at the sides, and with small, shining panes of glass through which the sun poured a golden flood of light on a long shelf of potted plants that took the place of a windowsill. The shelf was covered with shining white oilcloth, and the pots were clean reddish brown, the sturdy, stocky plants of bright green with clear red and white flowers. Elizabeth Ann's eyes wandered all over the kitchen, from the low white ceiling to the clean, bare wooden floor, and they always came back to those sunny windows. Once back in the big brick school building, as she had sat drooping her thin shoulders over her desk, some sort of a procession had gone by with a brass band playing a lively air. For some queer reason, every time she now glanced at that sheet of sunlight and the bright flowers, she had a little of the same thrill which had straightened her back and gone up and down her spine when the band was playing. Possibly Aunt Frances was right after all, and Elizabeth Ann was a very impressionable child. I wonder, by the way, if anybody ever saw a child who wasn't. At one end, the end where Cousin Ann was ironing, stood the kitchen stove, gleaming black, with a tea kettle humming away on it and a big hot water boiler near it, and a large kitchen cabinet with lots of drawers and shelves and hooks and things. Beyond that, in the middle of the room, was the table where they had supper last night, and at which the little girl now sat eating her very late breakfast. And beyond that, at the other end of the room, was another table with an old dark red cashmere shawl over it for a cover. A large lamp stood in the middle of this, a bookcase near it, 2 or 3 rocking chairs around it, and back of it, against the wall, was a wide sofa covered with a bright cretonne with 3 bright pillows. I totally mispronounced that word. Something big and black and woolly was lying on this sofa, snoring loudly. As Cousin Ann saw the little girl's fearful glance alighted on this, she explained, "That's Shep, our old dog. Doesn't he make an awful noise? Mother says when she happens to be alone here in the evening, it's real company to hear Shep snore, as good as having a man in the house." Although this did not seem at all a sensible remark to Elizabeth Ann, who thought soberly to herself she didn't see why a snoring made a dog as good as a man, still she was acute enough, for she really was an intelligent little girl, to feel that it belonged in the same class of remarks of 1 or 2 others that she had noted as odd in the talk at Putney Farm last night. This variety of talk was entirely new to her. Nobody in Aunt Harriet's conscientious household ever made nobody in Aunt Harriet's conscientious household ever making anything but plain statements of fact, which Aunt Harriet had forgotten to mention. It is perhaps possible. Oh, it was one of the odd Putney ways which Aunt Harriet had forgotten to mention. It is possible that Aunt Harriet had never noticed it. So for those of you just joining us, she'd moved from living with Aunt Frances and Aunt Harriet, because Aunt Harriet got consumption, to the Putney farm, and Aunt Harriet did not think highly of the Putneys. When Elizabeth Ann finished her breakfast, Cousin Anne had made 3 suggestions, using exactly the same accent for all of them. She said, "Wouldn't you better wash up your dishes now before they get sticky? And don't you want one of those red apples from the dish on the side table? And then maybe you'd like to look around the house so as you know where you are." Elizabeth Ann had never washed a dish in all her life, and had always thought that nobody but poor ignorant people who couldn't afford to hire girls did such thing. And yet, it was odd. She did not feel like saying this to Cousin Anne, who stood there so straight in her gingham dress and apron, with clear, bright eyes and red cheeks. Besides this feeling, Elizabeth was overcome with embarrassment at the idea of undertaking a new task in this casual way. How in the world did you wash a dish? She stood rooted to the spot, irresolute, horribly shy, looking as though she didn't know it, and looking, though she did not know it, very clouded and sullen. Cousin Anne said briskly, holding an iron up to her cheek to see if it was hot enough, "Just take them over to the sink there and hold them under the hot water faucet. They'll be clean in no time. The dish towels are those hanging over on the rack over the stove." Elizabeth Ann promptly moved over to the sink, as though Cousin Anne's words had shoved her there, and before she knew it, her saucer, cup, and spoon were clean, and she was wiping them on a dry check towel. "The spoon goes in the side table drawer with all the other silver, the saucer and cup in those shelves behind the glass door where the china belongs," continued Cousin Anne, thumping hard with her iron on a napkin and not looking up at all. "And don't forget your apple as you go out. Those northern spies are just getting to be good right now. When they first come off the tree in October, you could shoot them through an oak plank." Now Elizabeth Ann knew this was a foolish thing to say, since of course an apple could never go through a board. But something that had always been sound asleep in her brain woke up a little and opened one eye. For it occurred dimly to Elizabeth Ann that this was a rather funny way of saying that northern spies were very hard when you first picked them in the autumn. She had to figure it out for herself very slowly, because it was a new idea to her, and she was halfway through her tour of inspection of the house before there glimmered on her lips, in a faint smile, the first recognition of humor in all her life. She felt a momentary impulse to go call down to Cousin Anne that she saw the point, but before she had taken a single step towards the head of the stairs, she had decided not to do this. Cousin Anne, with her bright dark eyes and her straight back and her long arms and her way of speaking as though it never occurred to her that you wouldn't just do as she had said, Elizabeth Ann was not very sure that she liked Cousin Anne, and she was very sure that she was afraid of her. So she went on, walking from one room to another, industriously eating the red apple, the biggest she had ever seen. It was the best, too, with its crisp white flesh and the delicious sour sweet juice, which made Elizabeth Ann feel with each mouthful like hurrying to take another. She did not think more of the other rooms in the house than she had in the kitchen. There were no draped throws over anything. There were no lace curtains at the windows, just dotted Swiss like in the kitchen. All the ceilings were very low. The furniture was all dark wood and very old looking. What few rugs there were brightly covered rags. The mirrors were queer and old, with funny old pictures at the top. And there wasn't a brass bed in any of the bedrooms, just old wooden ones with posts and curtains around the tops. And there was not a single plush portiere in the parlor, whereas Aunt Harriet's, there had been 2 sets for that one room. She was relieved at the absence of a piano and secretly rejoiced that she would not need to practice. In her heart, she had not liked her music lessons at all, but had never dreamed of not accepting them from Aunt Frances, as she accepted everything else. Also, she had liked to hear Aunt Frances boast about how much better she could play than the other children her age. She was downstairs by this time and, opening a door out of the parlor, found herself back in the kitchen, the long line of sunny windows and bright flowers giving her that quick little thrill again. Cousin Anne looked up at her ironing and nodded and said, "All through? You better come in and get warmed up. These rooms get awfully cold these January days. Winters, we mostly use this room so as to get the good of the kitchen stove." She added after a moment, during which Elizabeth Ann stood by the stove warming her hands, "There's one place you haven't seen yet, the milk room. Mother's down there now churning. That's the door, the middle one." Elizabeth Ann had been wondering where Aunt Abigail was. So she stepped quickly to the door and went down the cold, dark stairs she found there. At the bottom was a door, apparently locked, for she could find no fastening. She heard steps inside, the door was briskly cast open, and she almost fell into the arms of Aunt Abigail, who caught her as she stumbled forward, saying, "Well, I've been expecting you down here for a long time. I never saw a little girl who didn't like to watch butter. I don't know what you make butter out of. We always bought ours." "Well, for goodness sake," said Aunt Abigail. She turned and called across the room, "Henry, did you ever? Betsy's saying she doesn't know what you make butter out of. She actually never saw anyone making butter." Uncle Henry was sitting down near the window, turning the handle of a small barrel swung between two uprights. He stopped for a moment and considered Aunt Abigail's remark with the same serious attention he had given to Elizabeth Ann's discovery about left and right. Then he began to turn the churn over and over and said peaceably, "Well, Mother, you never saw anyone laying asphalt pavement, I'll warn you. I suppose Betsy knows all about that." Elizabeth Ann's spirit rose. She felt very superior indeed. "Oh, yes," she reassured them. "I know all about that. Why, didn't you ever see anybody doing that? Why, I've seen them hundreds of times. Every day as we went to school, they were doing over whole pavements for blocks along there." Aunt Abigail and Uncle Henry looked at her with interest, and Aunt Abigail said, "Well, now think of that. Tell us all about it." "Well, there's a sort of big black wagon," said Elizabeth Ann, "and they run it up and down, and they pour the black stuff out on the road, and that's all there is to it." She stopped rather abruptly, looking uneasy. Uncle Henry inquired, "Now, there's one thing I've always wanted to know. How do they keep that stuff from hardening up on them? How do they keep it hot?" The little girl looked blank. "Why, a fire, I suppose," she faltered, searching her memory desperately and finding only a dim recollection of a red glow somewhere connected with the familiar scene at which she had so often looked with unseeing eyes. "Of course, a fire," said Uncle Henry. "But what do they burn in it? Coke or coal or wood or charcoal? And how do they get any draft to keep it going?" Elizabeth Ann shook her head. "I never noticed." Aunt Abigail asked her now, "What did they do to the road before they poured on?" "Do?" said Elizabeth Ann. "I didn't know they did anything." "Well, they can't pour it right on dirt, can they? Don't they put some cracked stone or something?" Elizabeth Ann looked at her toes. "I never noticed." "I wonder how long it takes for it to harden," said Uncle Henry. "I never noticed," said Elizabeth Ann in a small voice. Uncle Henry said, "Oh," and stopped asking questions. Aunt Abigail turned away and put a stick of wood in the stove. Elizabeth Ann did not feel very superior now, and when Aunt Abigail said, "Now, there's the butter beginning to come. Don't you want to watch and see everything I do so you can answer if anybody asks you how butter is made?" Elizabeth Ann understood perfectly what it was in Aunt Abigail's mind and gave to the process of butter making a more alert and aroused attention than she had ever given to anything. It was so interesting, too, that in no time she forgot why she was watching, and she was absorbed in the fascinations of the dairy for their own sake. She looked in the churn as Aunt Abigail unscrewed the top and saw the thick sour cream separating into buttermilk and tiny golden particles. "It's gathering," said Aunt Abigail, screwing the lid back on. "Father'll churn it a little bit more until it really comes, and you and I will scald the wooden butter things and make everything ready. You better take that apron there to keep your dress clean." Wouldn't Aunt Frances have been astonished if she could have looked in on Elizabeth Ann that very morning on her stay at the hateful Putney farm and seen her wrapped in a gingham apron, her face bright with interest, trotting here and there in the stone-floored milk room?
She was allowed the excitement of pulling out the plug from the bottom of the churn and dodged back hastily to escape the gush of buttermilk spouting into the pail held by Aunt Abigail. And she poured water into wash the butter and screwed on the top herself, again all by herself. For Uncle Henry had gone off as soon as the butter had come. Swung the barrel back and forth 6 or 7 times to swish the water all through the particles of butter. She even helped Aunt Abigail scoop out the great yellow clumps. Her imagination had never conceived of so much butter in the world. Then Aunt Abigail let her run the curiously shaped wooden butter worker back and forth over the butter, squeezing out the water, and then pile it up again with her wooden paddle into the mound of gold. She weighed out the salt needed on the scales and was very much surprised to find that there really is such a thing as an ounce. She had never met it before outside of the pages of her arithmetic book, and she didn't know it lived anywhere else. After the salt was worked in, she watched Aunt Abigail's deft, wrinkled old hands make pats and rolls. It looked like the greatest fun and too easy for anything. And when Aunt Abigail asked her if she would like to make up the last half-pound into a pat for dinner, she took up the wooden paddle confidently. And then she got one of the surprises that Putney Farm seemed to have for her. She discovered that her hands didn't seem to belong to her at all, that her fingers were all thumbs, that she didn't seem to know in the least beforehand how hard a stroke she was going to give, nor which way her fingers were going to do. It was, as a matter of fact, the first time Elizabeth Ann had tried to do anything with her hands, aside to write and figure and play on the piano, and naturally she wasn't very well acquainted with them. She stopped in dismay and looked at the shapeless, battered heap of butter before her, holding out her hands as though they were not part of her. Aunt Abigail laughed, and after 3 or 4 passes of the butter was a smooth yellow ball. "Well, that brings it all back to me," she said. "When I was a little girl and my grandmother first let me try and make a pat, I was 5 years old. My, what a mess I made. And I remember, doesn't it seem funny, that she laughed and said her great aunt Elmira had taught her how to handle butter right here in this very milk room. Let's see, grandmother was born the year of the Declaration of Independence was signed. That's quite a while ago, isn't it? But butter hasn't changed much, I guess, nor little girls either." Elizabeth Ann listened to the statement with a strange, startled expression on her face, as though she hadn't understood the words. Now for a moment she stood staring up in Aunt Abigail's face and not seeing her at all, because she was thinking so hard. She was thinking, why, there really were people living when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Real people, not just history people. Old women teaching little girls to do things right in this room, on this very floor, and the Declaration of Independence just signed. To tell the honest truth, although she had passed a very good examination in the little book on American history they had studied in school, Elizabeth Ann had never, to that moment, had any notion that there had ever really been any really and truly any Declaration of Independence at all. It had been like the ounce, living exclusively inside her school books for little girls to be examined about. And here, Aunt Abigail, talking about a butter pat, had brought it to life. Of course, all of this just lasted a moment, because it was such a new idea. She soon lost track of what she was thinking. She rubbed her eyes as though she were coming out of a dream, and she thought confusedly, what did butter have to do with the Declaration of Independence? Nothing, of course. It couldn't. And the whole impression seemed to pass off her mind. But it was an impression which was to come again and again during the next few months. That's the end of chapter 3, so I'll leave it there. And tomorrow at 4 o'clock this time, whatever time it is, 4 o'clock. Let me say that again. About 4 o'clock tomorrow, whatever time it is where you are, I'll be reading another picture book and do another section of Understood Betsy. I hope to see you then.